Hello, good evening, and welcome back. So, the Beirut protesters are getting stronger, they're gaining ground, they're going after their politicians for being corrupt and not caring about the individuals who are supposed to be voting for them and that they're supposed to be caring for them. The idea of a politician is that they are a public servant, and therefore, if they're not serving the public, then what are they there for? Because, of course, taxes are a way of taking part of your labour in order to give you something in return. And if they're not giving anything in return, but instead of making your life more difficult, they're not holding up their end of the bargain, but instead making your life worse, then why the hell are they there? And if you can't get rid of them, because they're all the same, and they get in the way of your democracy, then you don't really have a choice but violence. Violence is always a last resort, but it is still a resort. And that is what we're seeing here. And you might be thinking, yeah, but that's Lebanon. Why do we care about the global politics like this? And the reason is that whenever there is civil unrest in any country, all the other countries are going to be taking note as to what is happening, because they are going to be very concerned that they could end up with the same fate. Not so long ago, of course, we saw the Arab Spring, of which this is particularly emblematic of, because, as they say, angry protesters storm government ministries, that they know exactly who's responsible. They know why the ammonium nitrate was stored there for 6 years unprotected and what led to the explosion, because it's governmental oversight. And if they're not taking responsibility, if they're not going to say that, yes, we should do something about that, and instead just try and pass the blame, then of course they're going to be next. And we're seeing civil unrest in the West as well. Obviously, the Chaz, or CHOP, the so-called autonomous zone, which became the occupied protest, that was finally disbanded once they marched on the mayor's home, because the politicians don't like it when you get close to them, but they don't give a shit about anybody else. And I would say that the same goes in the UK, that, the grooming gang scandal has to be the latest and biggest one, where they haven't been deported, and so the abuse victims are seeing their abusers in Asda. They should not have been released from prison unless they're being deported, and yet they have been. That if this sees the light of day, if this becomes widespread knowledge, if it is known that nothing is happening about it, then you can be bloody well sure that the government is going to be on the receiving end of it. That's why we saw the All Girls Matter protest in London about a week ago now. Because, for whatever bloody reason, the government decides that, it's more important to respect Islamic paedophiles than it is the sanctity of British girls' innocence. And as we know, if the fathers of the girls decide to track them down and try to take their daughters back, they have a restraining order put on them by the police to not be hostile towards the abuser, and their daughters are then trafficked somewhere else so that they're never seen again. And it's well documented that we know this happens, and yet nothing, as of yet, has been done about it, which is why it is very important to find a country where it has reached its breaking point with the government not behaving and not helping the public as they should do, because every other government is always on that tipping point if they're trying to push an agenda that the public doesn't like, that you will get the straw that breaks the camel's back. And for some governments, it may not even be their particular final action, but instead seeing what is being done abroad. That you can imagine that the British government is going to be waiting with bated breath about how this protest turns out in Beirut, because if the protesters are successful, then people in Britain are going to be thinking, well, hey, maybe that we can actually do something over here. And combined with the quintupling of unemployment in the UK following the crap mismanagement of the COVID crisis, then yes, you can well imagine that people are going to be angry at the government. And if it's proven that the protesting is successful in Lebanon, then you can be sure that it's going to be tried in the UK. And okay, maybe only a fifth of the politicians are taken out, but none of the politicians want to be in that fifth. And those are odds that they are not going to be happy to take. So yes, of course they're going to be more responsive and a lot more concerned if the Beirut government falls, which is why you've seen a load of aid being provided by various Western countries, not because they give a shit about the protesters, but because they care about their own necks. Because we see here, protests in Beirut have stormed government ministries during a fresh demonstration over Tuesday's huge explosion that left at least 158 dead. Several thousand people took to the streets protesting. Police have fired tear gas at stone-throwing demonstrators. Sounds of gunfire have also been heard from central Martyr Square. In a televised address, Lebanese PM Hassan Diab said he would ask for early elections as a way out of the crisis. Not that that's doing much, mate. They're looking at nooses now. We can't exit the country's structural crisis without holding early parliamentary elections, he said. The issue will be discussed in Cabinet on Monday. If you can get to Monday. Christ. So to say here was the ammonium nitrate been held for 6 years and never moved. So dozens of protesters, more than dozens, stormed government ministries and the headquarters of the country's banking association. The raid started after a group of people chanting anti-government slogans and burning a portrait of President Michael Owen entered the foreign ministry and called for all ministries to be occupied. As we see here, just how close it is to the city. As they chanted, we have it, it's all ours. The places outside the gate, they could not stop us. One of the protesters, who identified herself as Rebecca, told the BBC. The protesters at the foreign ministry, at least 100, included retired army officers who are also sick to death of what's happened. And also in the UK, of course, the army is answerable to the Queen, not to the government. And the Queen loves to stay out of politics. So what do you think she'd do in those situations? Because she is not going to be siding with the government. Entry to the building was said to be easy as it had been damaged by Tuesday's explosion. The irony. Media reports that the army drove the original group of protesters out of the foreign ministry several hours later, but other buildings remained occupied. TV footage showed protesters breaking into the energy and economic ministries. Soldiers were also seen patrolling the streets in vehicles mounted with machine guns. Yes, we've heard live shots fired, but they didn't say which side. And a police officer has died, but because he fell into a lift shaft of a hotel, reportedly after being chased there by protesters. And when you've got enough protesters to get the police running, you know you've got a big problem. The local Red Cross said it treated 117 injured people at the scene. Another 55 were taken to hospital. They say dozens. And yet, from there, they've got 172 people injured or taken to hospital. It's not looking good, is it? Because, apart from showing the city's anger, the march was also meant to remember victims of the explosion, which injured 6,000, and around 300,000 people are homeless. So, yeah, of course, they're going to be annoyed. As they say, as the protest got underway, mock gallows were erected in Martyr Square to hammer home the demonstrators' view of the country's political leaders. But, as I say, many countries have already offered aid, including the UK, whose PM Boris Johnson spoke President Owen on Saturday and conveyed the UK's deepest sympathies to the Lebanese people, Downing Street said. Which, as I say, is just because they're concerned for their own necks. They're not concerned with the sympathy for the other people, not in this instance. They're just concerned that if they see that it turns towards violence and the uprising is successful, that the British people are going to be seeing the same thing and going to be thinking, well, maybe it's about time we did something as well. If we're not allowed to defend ourselves against people taking over our country with their own cultural practices, a more civil invasion than previous, but it's an invasion nonetheless, and they're being helped along by the useful idiots in the UK, then you can be bloody sure that there's going to be pushback against it. What people have known all their lives and are patriotic of the country, and with the army as well, serving the Queen, who, yes, of course, is Germanic origin, but is patriotic to the UK, no questions about it, that the government isn't, especially not any Labour councils. They're not patriotic in the slightest. So they're going to be the first to go. That is why the government is nervous about what's going on over there, because it's an example of what can happen anywhere in the world, including here. The saying goes that the population is just 3 meals away from anarchy, and with unemployment reaching the levels that it has, there is shit is really going to hit the fan. That I think it's going to be a tipping point in the next couple of years at maximum, and I'd hope that it ends up in a more freedom-loving way of saying the government doesn't know what it's doing. They shouldn't meddle. Let's just get the government not involved and allow people to get on with their lives. How about that? What a radical thought. Maybe the British who left for America were right. But, of course, only time will tell. So we'll see how Beirut turns out and how concerned that they are. But, as always, until next time, have a good one.